Hello, everybody. This is Peter Ambler. I am the executive director and a co-founder of Giffords, Gabby Giffords, Gun Violence Prevention Organization, coming to you from Oakland, California. We've got sort of participants from all across the country here, Connecticut, Tucson, Chicago, and I believe talking to voters from across America in all 50 states about here on the first installment of our Road to Universal Background Checks tour. Typically, Gabby would be getting in a beat up old bus and, going from state to state on the actual hustings, because no one loves a old school campaign like Gabby Giffords. But obviously, in this time when we're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, we're gathering virtually, and thank you for doing that. Before we dive into the program, I'm going to get us started off with a video that we put together to remind us why we're here and, more importantly, where we're headed.
For the first time since the Clinton administration, the House of Representatives passes significant gun legislation.
This bill would basically require background checks for almost every gun sale or gun transfer in America.
Enough is enough. And our first order of business in the Senate should be to pass the House Background Checks Act.
As long as I'm the majority leader of the Senate, none of that stuff is going anywhere. I am indeed the Grim Reaper.
Over 90% of Americans support expanding background checks.
By closing these loopholes, we will make our communities safer.
We have a mission. We have an obligation. It is the right thing to do to save lives.
The Senate is a firewall for the NRA.
And change must come to Washington.
There are now more activists on the side of gun safety than on the side of the NRA.
Now is the time to come together. Be courageous. The nation's counting on you.
All right. Wow, that was incredibly inspiring watching that. I'm fired up, and I've seen that video before, so I can only imagine the impact that y'all feel, sort of being reminded of the stakes in this election. So, welcome again to the Road to Universal Background Checks tour. This virtual tour is traversing the country, stopping in key Senate races, key House races, framing the battle for the presidency. It was, a little over a year ago that we passed H.R. 8, Universal Background Checks, through the House of Representatives in the wake of, one of the biggest gun safety elections, 2018, when we beat 40 NRA-backed Republican incumbents and elected in their place a gun safety majority in the House. That majority delivered for the voters by, passing universal background checks, enacting, life-saving research into gun violence prevention at the CDC and the NIH. But we're being held back by the obstinance of Mitch McConnell in the Senate and Donald Trump in the White House. So what we're going to be doing tonight and in the weeks to come is framing this national debate about gun safety for the 2020 election around our number one policy priority, universal background checks. We're honored to have with us today the Senate sponsor of universal background checks, Senator Chris Murphy from the state of Connecticut, who, not long into his service in the House of Representatives, experienced the Sandy Hook shooting in his congressional district, who was a friend and classmate of Gabby's when they came into Congress together, and is just an unparalleled national leader for gun safety, and who every step of the way has helped us, push the ball forward and lead from coast to coast in all 50 states around getting universal background checks and other important gun safety measures passed. We're also joined by Tre Bosley, an activist and a survivor from Chicago, who has been a Giffords Courage Fellow, a youth fellow. He's been active in March for Our Lives and has been a clarion, compelling voice for the gun safety movement, along with really thousands of other young activists in this country who are really calling the question, calling, as they say, BS, and demanding life-saving action from our leaders in Congress. These are dark and difficult times for us as a country. We're in the midst of an unprecedented historic pandemic that's threatening the health and safety of our families and our neighbors. We're in the midst of a national reckoning over racial equity and injustice and police brutality. But even in difficult moments like this, I come to engagements and events like this with a lot of hope. And I have a lot of hope because I know that Election Day 2020 is less than 4 months away. And that if we're able to win just a handful of important races, win control of the Senate, win control of the White House, keep our majority in the House, that doesn't just put an end to Mitch McConnell's tenure as majority leader. That doesn't just put an end to Donald Trump's presidency, but it also paves the way for positive action on gun safety and sends, Gabby Giffords to the Rose Garden to stand next to Chris Murphy, to stand next to Tre Bosley, standing next to President Joe Biden, signing universal background checks into law. That gives me a lot of hope. It gets me energized about the next 4 months to do what we got to do to elect the gun safety majority in the Senate, defeat Donald Trump, elect Joe Biden. So I am going to wrap it up right there. And Gabby, I'm hoping to turn it over to you and see if you might be willing to, summon some more hope and courage with some words for us.
I've known the darkest of days of pain and uncertain recovery. But confronted by despair, I've summoned hope. Confronted by paralysis and aphasia, I responded with grit and determination. I put one foot in front of the other. I found one word and then I found another. My recovery is a daily fight, but fighting makes me stronger. Words once came easily. Today I struggle to speak. But I have not lost my voice. America needs all of us to speak out, even when you have to fight to find the words. I'm also in a second fight, the fight to stop gun violence. It's also a fight forged by tragedy and pain, a fight that can change lives. We are at a crossroads. We can let the shooting continue, or we can act. We can protect our family, our future. We can vote. We can protect our family, our future. Please join us in this fight. Vote, vote, vote. Thank you very much.
Wow, Gabby, that was phenomenal. Sorry, it was beautiful. But I'm fired up. And Tre, you are also a great source of inspiration and courage. And like Gabby, like Senator Murphy, like millions of other Americans, you have turned your grief into action. And you've accomplished so much, lending your voice and your passion to this movement. It's safe to say we wouldn't be here where we are today with this great opportunity that I talked about without you. You have, asked President Obama a question about this. You challenged the leader of the free world on this issue at a CNN town hall. You spoke at the March for Our Lives rally. But if you don't mind, I would ask you to sort of take it back a little bit and tell us a little bit about your brother who you lost, what led you to activism, and how tragedy has shaped your advocacy.
Yeah, well, prior to my brother being killed, my cousin, he was shot in December 2005, and that was just my first introduction to gun violence. And then it hit even closer to home when my brother Tre Bosley, he was shot and killed at church April 4th, 2006, while getting ready for band rehearsal. And around that time, I was only 7 years old, and I didn't really understand what was going on. But as I got older, I began to realize and lose more people to gun violence, and more people were being shot. And I knew that I had to try to be the change. I no longer want to see families crying and being hurt by gun violence. So I began working with different organizations. I started working with the Brave Youth Leaders of St. Sabina, which is a group of youth that go around the community and do different forms of work, whether it's petitions, marches, rallies, whatever it may be. We try to come together and create change. And that was just the main thing that I knew that I had to do. I didn't want anyone else to experience the loss that I had. So I had to go out and be the voice for the people.
Well, thanks for that. Now, Senator Murphy, if you don't mind, I'll turn it over to you. I've heard you speak really eloquently, passionately about not just sort of specific policy measures necessarily, though you are the sponsor of the universal background checks bill in the U.S. Senate, the person who led the filibuster there around universal background checks and gun safety. But you've had some very wise words about what we have accomplished as a movement over the past 7 or 8 years. And I was hoping you might speak to the sort of historic strength of the gun safety movement and what you see it accomplishing now and over the next few months leading into the election. And you're muted.
Peter, can you hear me okay?
There you go.
Yep, can you hear me okay now? All right, great. Listen, Gabby, those are just absolutely inspirational words. As Peter mentioned, Gabby and I came in together into the House of Representatives in 2006, and I've just been inspired to watch you grow a movement which is on the precipice of just enormous social change. It's going to save lives. Tre, thanks for sharing your story and speaking truth to power. It matters. And to all the activists on this call, you are part of one of the great social change movements in the history of this country, and you are going to have a resounding success to tell your kids and your grandkids about if we do what we need to do over the course of the next several months. Peter talked about how this movement has grown. I was new to this movement in December of 2012 when a tragedy happened in Connecticut in Sandy Hook. And a lot of people thought that everything changed at that moment, that we were going to get a universal background checks bill, we were going to get a ban on assault weapons, because how could this nation not be moved by the murder of 20 first graders? Fast forward to April of 2013, and not only did we not get a ban on assault weapons, we couldn't even muster enough votes to pass an expansion of background checks in this country. And what I discovered through that very painful process, as families of those who were lost in Newtown, but also in Chicago and Hartford and New Orleans and Baltimore, came to Congress to ask for this change, is that what we lacked was political power. What the NRA had, what the gun lobby had built over the course of 40 years was a political juggernaut. And they were ready for that moment. They were ready for a fairly disorganized group of parents and survivors who came to the Capitol to ask for change to prevent that kind of slaughter from happening ever again. And so in that moment, thankfully, we had people like Gabby Giffords and others who rallied to help build a political organization that now, 7 to 8 years later, is ready to win. We are, I think, Peter, stronger than the gun lobby, and we showed that in 2018. That's why we elected a House of Representatives that now supports universal background checks. But because you can only elect 1/3 of the Senate at a time, and because in 2018 we couldn't do anything about who was in the White House, we need to finish the job this fall. I'm reminded of how important our work is every single day, because I know there's 90% of Americans that want universal background checks. And I know what a difference that they will make. We still have far too many shootings happening in my state, in Hartford and New Haven and in Bridgeport. But we have far less happening in Connecticut and other parts of the country because we have universal background checks. We have 4 times less shootings that happen in Connecticut than in Florida. It's not coincidental. Our state has one of the strictest background checks regimes, and Florida has one of the loosest. But what we also know is that all of the guns that do eventually get used in crimes in our state, often crimes being committed against young African-American men in our cities, are guns that were bought outside of Connecticut, guns that were bought in states that don't have universal background checks and brought into the state of Connecticut. Guns used in New York City, a survey showed, are almost never bought in New York City. 1% of them are bought across the river in New Jersey. Almost all of them are bought from places like South Carolina and Georgia and Florida, where criminals can buy guns. Gun traffickers can buy guns without having to prove that they are eligible under federal law. And so we have an opportunity to run a political operation all across this country to elect Joe Biden and elect Democrats to the Senate. And when we do, we are going to pass universal background checks. And when we pass universal background checks, we are literally going to save tens of thousands of lives in this country. When Connecticut passed our law, our gun homicides went down by 40%. 40%. Now, even if we only get a 20% reduction nationally, think of the tens of thousands of fewer grieving families that will exist across this country. But we have our work cut out for us because the Senate races we need to win, that this tour is going to be traveling to, right now are close. The Senate races we need to win are 1 or 2 points our way, 1 or 2 points the other way in the polls. And lastly, Peter, what we know is that increasingly the issue of gun violence is A, an issue that swing voters make their decisions about, and B, an issue that motivates sort of low propensity voters to come out to the polls. Young people, they care about a bunch of things, but one of the things they care about is gun violence. And they're thinking about staying home. But if they know that gun violence and background checks is on the ballot, they're coming out. And for swing voters, who frankly, 6 years ago, didn't have guns on their top 10 list, it's now number 1, number 2, number 3. In the Virginia elections last fall, which is still a swing state, guns was the number 1 issue for voters at the polls. And so if we can organize around this issue, around the issue of universal background checks, we're going to drive up turnout for our candidates, and we're going to convince swing voters. And you're going to elect a Senate that will join the House of Representatives and pass a universal background checks bill. And I say that knowing that the filibuster is still an obstacle. People will say, well, even if you got 51 Democrats in the Senate, you need 60? Let me tell you, if we put a universal background checks bill on the floor of the Senate, it's going to get 60 votes. I know that because last summer I had all sorts of Senate Republicans, my friends, coming to me and telling me, boy, if you can get that bill to the floor of the Senate, if you can get Donald Trump to support it, I'll vote for it this time. These were people that voted against it back in 2013. Why have they changed their tune? Because of the movement that you've built, because they do not want to stand for re-election with a no vote on universal background checks. But Mitch McConnell stops that bill from even coming up for a vote in the Senate. If we get it to the floor of the Senate for a vote, which we can if Democrats are in charge, it will get the votes necessary to pass. And that's the work that we have ahead of us over the course of the next several months. Peter, I think I have the opportunity now to play a video here. And this is going to, I think, move people even more because this is a video about the work that Gabby put in to get to the point today where she can lead this national movement. And I'm going to have a quick question for her afterwards, but I want to have an opportunity to show everybody firsthand the courage it has taken for my friend Gabby to get to the point today where she can give those beautiful remarks and help lead us in our work towards November.
What is courage? What does it look like? Courage shows truth to power and stands its ground. It's walking out. It's sitting down. It's marching towards something greater. Courage is telling your story even when it's hard to speak. Courage looks like this.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Gabby Giffords from Southern Arizona.
You know, you can either complain about something or you can try to fix it.
I will always extend my hand across the aisle to do what's right for the American people, to build consensus, and to get the job done.
Earlier today, a number of people were shot in Tucson, Arizona.
Arizona Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, wounded in an assassination attempt just about 2 weeks ago, is about to take the next big step along what's expected to be a long road to recovery.
It takes courage to keep going, especially when it feels impossible.
To witness the return of our colleague, who is the personification of courage, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords.
And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
It's standing up and finding your voice again. Courage is speaking out. Courage is saying, we can do better. And knowing no problem is too big to fix.
Gabby, we are just all in awe of you. And as your friend, I'm just so excited to be part of this movement with you. We all, those of us who are close to you, remember exactly where we were that day 9 years ago on January 8th. It's amazing to think that it was 9 years ago. And so I guess my question for you, Gabby, is just really, really simple. Just tell us what you've learned from your experiences over the last 9 years.
To be friends and family, and to live every day to the fullest.
Well, you have done that, Gabby. You have done that. And frankly, you have commanded the rest of us to do the same. I constantly think about whether I'm measuring up to the example that you've set. But I also think about whether I'm measuring up to the example that Tre has set. And the millions of survivors and family and friends from all across this country, whether they lost someone in a mass shooting or whether they lost someone in a scuffle on a street corner, in a random shooting, in an accidental shooting. Every single life lost is unnecessary and preventable, and that's what our movement is all about. So, Gabby, you inspire us, and I know we want to get to a Q&A here for our panel, but I'm just so proud to be part of this event with you and with you, Tre, as well.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, so now it's Q&A portion. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or another platform, just throw your questions and comments in, the comment section. And we will go through and get to as many as possible. But Tre, I'm actually going to start with you, not to ask you a question, but to give you the opportunity. I know you had a question for Senator Murphy, so let me just sort of pass the proverbial microphone over to you and let you kick it off.
All right, thank you. Senator Murphy, first, I want to thank you for your leadership on gun violence prevention. Your time in the Senate has really been shaped by your fight for stronger gun laws. And as you know, Senator, a lot of guns that are used in shootings like the one that killed my brother 14 years ago are illegal. Whether it be coming from a loophole in legislation, people purchasing guns across state lines, or random trains filled with guns being left in poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Guns flow through our neighborhoods. And I've been fighting since my brother's death to stop everyday shootings. I'm grateful for the work that you're doing for universal background checks. and I will be with you every step of the way. But my question to you is, how is Congress addressing the daily shootings that are happening in Black and brown communities around the nation and often go ignored and overlooked?
Well, Trey, I appreciate that. And, the 2 days that, of course, stay with me from 2012, 2013 is first, of course, the day of the shooting in Sandy Hook. But then the second moment that I will never, ever forget is about a month later being in a community center in the north end of Hartford, Connecticut, surrounded by African-American parents of mostly sons, but sons and daughters who had fallen over the course of decades of near nightly gun violence in that neighborhood of our capital city. And those families were furious. They were absolutely furious because they grieved, frankly, harder than anybody for those kids in Sandy Hook, because they know what that pain feels like. They know what those parents are going through. But they couldn't understand why this country wasn't willing to stand up for their kids in the way that the country seemed willing to stand up for the kids in Sandy Hook. And that is why it is so important for us to command this country to pay attention to this issue every single day. 100 people die every single day from gun violence. There's 5 Sandy Hooks every day in this country. Now, 2/3 of them are suicides, but many of those suicides can be prevented as well by stronger gun laws. And the crimes that you're talking about, committed largely against people of color, largely against young people of color in our cities, has to be our daily focus, just as much as these mass shootings that capture the headline news are. I'll just say 2 quick things about it, Trey. First, I just think we got to be honest about the systematic persecution and subjugation of people of color in this country, and the cycle of marginality and violence that system of systematic oppression puts them in. If you really look at what indicators track with violence, poverty, frankly, is the clearest indicator of whether you are going to be the victim of violence in this country. And because we have relegated communities of color to never-ending cycles of poverty, we have also relegated communities of color to exposure to gun violence. So if we don't do something in this moment about building a new civil rights movement, then we're not being honest about attacking the violence that exists in our cities. But as you also mentioned, the guns that flood into these cities, they are illegal guns. And if guns weren't so easy to access in certain neighborhoods, there wouldn't be as many gun crimes. And so the day that we pass universal background checks is the day that we make it that much harder for a gun trafficker to sell a mess load of illegal weapons out of the trunk of a car in Chicago or in Hartford or in New Orleans. And you will see, just like you saw in Connecticut, this rapid diminution in gun crimes everywhere, once there are fewer illegal weapons available. But until you have universal national background checks, there's nothing that a state can do to protect themselves from that. So that's why this needs to be national. And that's why this is a solution for every kind of gun crime in this country.
Thanks so much for that. Now, Trey, I'm going to turn it around and got a question for you from Elliot on Facebook, who writes, what can we be doing as young people who are engaged and understand what's at stake to engage and motivate our friends who may be less enthused by the candidates on the ticket and particularly skeptical about authority and government in the last few months in light of the uprisings and responses?
Well, that's a great question. And just one way to answer that is just to let it be known that the presidential election is not the only election going on that can have a huge change in communities impacted by gun violence. You have your local officials, whether that be your mayor or your alderman or whatever it may be in your city, but those elections matter just as much as the presidential election. So one thing that they need to do for sure is to make sure that their friends are voting, whether if they don't want to vote in the presidential election, make sure they're still voting in elections around them. And also, they can still be using their voices, whether it's outside of the election, it's pushing the people that do end up getting in office to do what we need them to do. whether we have to shut down businesses, whether we have to shut down expressways, whatever we want to do, we need to make sure that we're putting the right foot forward in order to get our voices heard. So for those friends, push them to try to vote in the presidential election, because for sure we know what's going to happen. But we need to also push them to do other things in their community. It doesn't stop with the presidential election. It's more things that contribute to gun violence than just the one election.
Great. I appreciate that, Trey. We definitely need young people holding us accountable by definition. Compared to any other group, young people have the greatest stake in our future. Now, as a parent myself, I just sort of feel like we're failing our kids and putting them at risk. But let's see. Going over here to the next question, which comes to Senator Murphy from Nicole on YouTube. She says, "Thank you for all of the work you have done to pass background checks. As we look ahead to next year, once we have flipped the Senate," I like that. "Once we flip the Senate and replace Trump, how do we hold our members of Congress accountable to make sure they pass background checks once and for all?" All right, so Senator Murphy, it's 2011. We've got the new president, the new Senate sworn in. How do we keep the foot on the gas and actually get this thing done?
Well, listen, it's a great question, and that accountability starts right now. You've got to work to make sure that you're getting candidates on the record in support of universal background checks and the strongest version of universal background checks bill. Remember, there's a lot of different versions of expanded background checks. What we want is universal background checks. We want every gun sale in this country to be subject to a background check. And so what we need you to do right now, when you're talking to candidates, when you're interacting with them online, is ask them, are they prepared to support H.R. 8? Are they prepared to support universal background checks? And are they going to make it a priority when they get elected? So make sure that this is a conversation that is happening in your state, and make sure that it's a conversation that's happening within your Senate race or your House race, because frankly, that will help get your candidate elected. The more that background checks is a topic of conversation, the more that our enemies will be exposed. Listen, there's very few issues like this where 90% of people are on our side. So if we expose the other side as being against H.R. 8, then that's just going to improve our side's chances. And then come next year, we're just going to need you to keep fighting. The election is the most important thing right now. But as I mentioned, we still may have to put a bunch of pressure on some other Senate Republicans to get it over the hump. And so we're going to continue to need this movement, putting pressure on Congress even after this election. The election is the most important thing, but keeping that movement up is really, really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. A big part of Gabby's and our organization's political philosophy is that mandates matter, right? So it's not just about electing people who happen to sort of be people who want to do the right thing and vote the right way, right? It's electing them because of their advocacy and their support for universal background checks and other stronger gun laws. Because shifting that political calculus, and the senator has spoken eloquently to this already during this presentation. But shifting the political calculus is raising this issue in terms of levels of salience among voters is what's really kind of driving a lot of the activity that we see. And obviously, we pass H.R. 8 and other measures through the House of Representatives, but we see a lot of activity across the states, right? At the same time, while you've got Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump telling us no, no, no in Washington, and refusing to kids and communities, while taking tens of millions of dollars from the NRA. Let's be clear, in 2016, the NRA spent over $50 million in support of its federal candidates, over 30 of which went to Donald Trump himself. And you've seen this sort of play out, right? Where one of these horrific tragedies happens, and even Donald Trump has moved to a point where he says, okay, maybe I'm open to background checks. Maybe I actually want to meet the moment and respond and do something to protect Americans from gun violence. But then you see representatives from the NRA actually scurry to the White House sit down with the president, and mere hours later, like clockwork, President Trump and his staff are backtracking. And now they literally have a former gun industry lobbyist crafting gun policy in the White House. I mean, so the stakes couldn't be higher. The contrast here couldn't be more clear. But I want to move on to the next question here. It comes from a survivor, Sandy, on Twitter. And she says, Gabby, you've always been an inspiration to me. You stay so active, both fighting for gun laws and to campaign against those who stand in our way, like Mitch McConnell and Trump. Since you can't get out on the road like I know you'd like, and I do know, Gabby, that you would like to get out on the road, how else are you staying busy during coronavirus? Yeah, tell us about how you're filling the time.
I'm so busy. Yoga twice a week, French horn, Spanish lesson, riding my bike, a lot of Zooms, Spanish lessons, homework, physical homework, the movie. It's Groundhog Day. It's Groundhog Day.
Or now we can say there's a new movie out called Palm Springs on Hulu, which is like the Groundhog Day. The Groundhog Day Redux, the modern version, which I watched last night, and is actually pretty entertaining. It was Gabby's reminds me of a story. I think you had just been on a bus tour of the country, and you were literally walking out of like the Atomic Cafe in Bismarck, North Dakota.
Yes.
Out there advocating for universal background checks and stronger gun laws. This is several years ago. And before that, you and Mark had just been on some like nice vacation somewhere. And I sort of asked you as a joke. I was like, "Oh, so Gabby, what did you prefer, like your fabulous sort of vacation or this hard scrabble background checks tour that included stops in Alaska, North Dakota, and other parts of the country?" And you just looked me straight in the face and you're like, "Bus tour."
Bus tour.
You were dead serious. Gabby, thank you so much for your inspiring words before, and for keeping us all up to date on what you're doing to fill your days. Hopefully we'll be back on the road in some way, shape, or form before too long. So I think that's probably all that we have time for in terms of questions, but I wanted to turn it back over to Senator Murphy, because Senator, in so many ways, we've been following your lead in terms of trying to get change from Washington, and you've been a big part of breaking through the noise, speaking truth to power, and making sure we're all sort of putting together an effective strategy to get life-saving action done. And I want to go back to one thing you said. You mentioned that study that came out from Johns Hopkins about the changes that Connecticut made to its gun laws in the 90s, and talking about how gun homicides went down 40% after you changed those laws. And that wasn't just sort of coincidence. Like, real research went into that, showing that the laws that you passed directly resulted in the life-saving impact there in Connecticut. So, it's easy, especially these days, to throw up our hands and to feel powerless. But if you need any greater example of the power that we have as citizens, as politicians and elected leaders like yourselves, as youth advocates, Tre, to actually get something done to really save lives, to have a life-saving impact on people's lives, just remember those numbers, that strong gun laws save lives. So Senator, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close us out, call us to action, and lift up the work that we're doing. And just Tre, thank you so much for being here. Gabby, you're an inspiration as always. And Senator, thank you again, and over to you.
Peter, thanks for convening us. Gabby, always great to be with you. I'll see you out there on the campaign trail, even if it's virtually. Tre, thanks for your tremendous leadership. Listen, Peter, you said it. When it comes down to it, what matters more to us as human beings than protecting our loved ones, our children, our brothers, our sisters, our parents from physical harm, right? There's nothing else that matters more to us than protecting those people that are closest to us from being harmed, from death. And you square that with where this country sits today. This country, which, is a leader in almost every facet of life that is so important to us, right? We invented modern participatory democracy. We invented the modern capitalist economy, the way we communicate right now via the internet, invented by the United States of America. We are global leaders in almost every sector that matters to our daily lives, except violence. When it comes to the ability to protect ourselves from physical harm, the United States isn't a leader. We're a global laggard. We have 20 times more gun violence in this country than in any other advanced nation. And it's not because we're more genetically prone to violence. It's not because we have more mental illness. It's not because we spend less money on law enforcement. It's because we have a celebratory culture of guns and a series of wildly loose gun laws that allow those weapons to be used all too frequently to kill innocent people. And as you said, Peter, what's so maddening is that we know how to do better. We know how to protect the Second Amendment and allow legitimate law-abiding Americans to be able to own a gun, to protect themselves or to hunt, and to also save tens of thousands of lives. Why? Because we've done it in a place like Connecticut, right? You can still buy a gun if you want one to protect your home or to go out and shoot for sport in my state. But we make it a little bit harder for criminals to get guns. And that has resulted in thousands of people being alive today in my state. And so why not give that gift to the country? Well, the reason is because the other side has a political movement that has been too strong. And this is the election where the tipping point happens, where our movement becomes so strong and so inevitable that we beat the gun lobby. You said it, Peter. There is a gun industry lobbyist running gun policy for this White House. And so it wasn't a mystery to any of us when Trump flirted with a background checks bill last summer and then immediately pulled back. Because you know what? The NRA has unconditional, unfettered access to the White House, and they have control of Mitch McConnell. Well, we need to be in control of the White House, not the gun lobby. We need to be in control of the United States Senate, not the gun industry. And we can do that this November. It only takes a handful of Senate races to flip control of the body. The Electoral College is going to be tight. And the anti-gun violence movement, in and of itself, if we power up, if we do a little bit more in states that matter, we can make the difference. Because all of a sudden, over the course of a half a decade, our issue, the issue of saving people's lives from gun violence, has become, as I mentioned, a deciding issue for swing voters, a motivating issue for folks that may be thinking about not turning out. And so it's incumbent upon us to step up and do all of that work. Now, that work's going to look a little bit different this year than it did 2 years ago. We're going to have to be a little bit more creative about how we go out and find voters, tell them about the differences between Senate candidates on the issue of gun violence. But it's never, ever been more important. Think about if at the end of your life, you get to look back on being a part of a movement that passed a piece of legislation that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Very few people get to say that. And the people that are on this call are going to be able to say that. And I'll just leave you with this, Gabby and Peter and Tre. You know, there's a lot of people, since tragedy happened in their life, or since they were moved by somebody else's tragedy, who thought about giving up. A lot of folks who, frankly, you know, in my state, who have been working the gun violence epidemic for 40 years, have thought about giving up many, many times. But what I know is that the great social change movements in the history of this country, the ones that you read about in the history books, are the ones that met adversity over and over and over again and didn't give up, who were so convinced of the righteousness of their cause that they kept on going. Now, we've hit adversity, a lot of it, because we still haven't passed that universal background checks bill, but we get closer every single election cycle. And if we turn up our work and our advocacy and our activism over the short 4 to 5 months that stand ahead of us, we are going to elect a Senate that will make background checks a priority, a president who will make it a priority, and we will re-elect a House of Representatives that will once again put H.R. 8 as a priority bill early in the 2021 session. And when we pass that bill, you will have been part of one of those great change movements that the history books write about. And I'm just proud to be a member of that movement, along with people that I celebrate, like Gabby, Tre, and the thousands and thousands of other survivors out there, and family members of those who have fallen, who are going to get us across the finish line. So, Peter, thanks for making me a part of this. And I think this tour is going to be so important. Follow this tour. It's going to be going all across the country to the swing states, the states that really matter when it comes to control of the Senate and the presidency. And so follow this tour and be active in any way that you can to help elect anti-gun violence candidates in seats that matter.
Can I make one more statement?
Yeah, go for it, Tre.
All right. I just wanted to make one more call and one more push for everybody listening. I just want everybody to understand the time for being timid and overwhelmed is far gone. The little boy who has to dodge gunfire to get home to school, get to school every day, his opportunity to be timid is gone. The little girl who cries herself to sleep because her mother was shot and killed is overwhelmed. The parents who have to bury their child who was shot and killed in their living room doesn't get the chance to grieve. I want everybody listening to understand that gun violence is an issue that is harming people like me and many people similar to me every day. People are dying here in Chicago through COVID, through police, and through gun violence. And our lives depend on the actions that you make when it comes to voting and when it comes to protesting. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to wrap us up now. Gabby, Senator Murphy, Tre, thank you. I'll just say, like, what y'all are saying right now is resonating. I'm getting updates. We have, over 10,000 people who have tuned in to today's panel over Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other platforms. So thank you to everybody who's participated. Like Senator said, we are the change makers, all of us. Who are watching and have tuned in today. And I have the fullest confidence in the world that we're going to get this done. So we'll see you down the road. And thank you very much.
Thanks.